I made this channel in part because I wanted to try my hand at a devlog, but having now come to this point, it feels weirdly self-indulgent. Well, I've tried to trim the script, so here it goes. This is Flameland, a game I made in 7th grade, that I remade in college, that I remade after college, that I remade after grad school, that I'm finally making now, well, I think. It's a 2D platformer that was my first attempt at something more than a clone. With Flameland, I took the character from my very first game and asked, what if I made a new move for a 2D platformer? Mario jumps, Kirby eats, Sonic rolls, Samus shoots, all of these are basic ideas. What basic idea can I build a game around? What about fire breath? But Kirby has fire breath. What if you can move while you do it? What if you just had an on-off switch? Character is deadly, character is vulnerable. And this was fun, like Sonic's roll, but with no need to charge up. On, off, on, off. Almost like basing a whole game around the Wonder Wing from Banjo-Kazooie. I wanted to make a game that you played straight through from start to finish in one sitting, like Kirby's Dream Land or Sonic the Hedgehog. But I wanted it to feel different playthrough to playthrough, so I decided it would have multiple paths, like Star Fox 64. It was with these ideas that I made a game about Flame, a dragon, and 3 pals who set out to defeat the king and save the dragons he was imprisoning. I gave up making games for 6 years. When I started dabbling again in college, I returned to Flameland and decided to remake it. In Iteration 2, the dragons you freed became playable characters. And I introduced this 300-second timer, which was meant to be for each level, but then I accidentally programmed it to last the whole game, and I actually liked that. I decided my brand would be called 5-Minute Games, and I added a new core value. Iteration 2 is also where I started on a very bad habit of building forever on a very rocky foundation. By the time Iteration 2 was done, there was the typical arcade mode, but also a mission mode, a long play mode with a save file, a co-op mode that was so hard it was almost unplayable. I think many of these extra modes worked against the design aesthetic of a short game. Moreover, by the time I was done with everything, I'd learned enough that the foundations felt obsolete. Iteration 3 was a flash game lost to the sands of time, but it was a reaction against these problems. It was shorter and narrower with fewer playable characters, but this meant the game was less explorable. And I'm kind of glad it's lost because it was glitchy as all get out. That brings us to Iteration 4. Now, each iteration is a reaction to the last one, and right now I'm working on Iteration 5, so I'm really reacting to Iteration 4. That means I think this first devlog should be a postmortem on Flameland Iteration 4. I do not call it Flameland 4, I say Iteration 4 because I think these are all failed prototypes, and I'm working on the first game now. This version was an attempt to return to that second core idea. It was going to be bigger and more explorable than any version before it. To that end, it introduced the dragon switching mechanic, where you enter the game not with one playable character out of a list, but a team of playable characters that you assemble and then switch between mid-game, meaning there were now even more ways to play. There are 80 dragons total, and that variety is what made this iteration enjoyable. I don't think that's a virtue. I think I leaned too heavily on variety and novelty as a crutch, but novelty was fun, and I knew how to do novelty. Different dragons have different abilities and stats. The worse the ability, like this awkwardly aimed bomb, the better the stats. Like, look how high he jumps. Differentiated stats allowed me to better balance the dragons and make each dragon feel unique, but they also made the switching mechanic feel awkward. And the different jump heights in particular complicated the level building. Also, unfortunately, as different dragons have different abilities, the first core idea has become de-emphasized. To try to combat this, I made it so fire dragons all attack in that on-off fashion. And additionally, some of the water dragons have abilities that feel like variations on the on-off ability. Ultimately, though, I have to admit that I am sacrificing some focus on the first core idea in favor of the second, even continuing into Iteration 5. But an interesting idea emerged this iteration. To complement the variety of characters, I decided that dragons would have types, and each type would be able to interact with different elements of the level. You could say the type system complicates the team building, but I actually think it helps simplify it. Rather than, I have 80 dragons, which 4 do I want? The player thinks, I want 1 fire dragon out of these 20, and 1 water dragon out of these 15, and so on. Expert players can still make a team of all water dragons, but beginner players maybe have a way to get their foot in the door in the team building. In Iteration 4, I thought very carefully about having multiple pathways, and having ways to switch between those pathways, and having something at every moment on those pathways, so that the level felt very full. Unfortunately, I forgot to make the levels fun. There is something charming about unlocking different dragons and trying out their abilities in new combinations, and I think in the meantime, I didn't notice that my level designs were so busy that there was no room to breathe, and so generic that they really didn't have any exciting moments. I was thinking a little about general game design principles, how you can introduce an idea, complicate it, and twist it, but my twists were boring, and I was coming up against another problem. The levels didn't have set beginnings. In Iteration 4, where you begin a level depends on the level you're coming from, so the island and underland both lead to the mainland, but you start here if you come from the island, and here if you come from the underland. This let me experiment with varying the level length without changing the game length, but it made it harder to introduce gimmicks in a consistent, safe way. And so I decided to ditch the traditional formula of introducing gimmicks and then twisting them. And instead I just tried to make most of the gimmicks simple and self-explanatory, and consequently not very interesting. And besides that, because I wasn't a very good programmer or level tester, many of the gimmicks were not very fun. Additionally, level-specific enemies are a great way to give levels distinct flavor, but that hadn't occurred to me yet. So in Iteration 4, any enemy can appear in any level, and I think that was a missed opportunity. Now, I do like that the levels have unique backgrounds. I thought very carefully about that, and I tried to avoid reusing the same colors. And I also really appreciate how the openings to levels can sometimes feel very distinct. I did take some time to think about how the structure of platforms would change the feel of the game. In the end, had I de-emphasized level gimmicks, I think this game would have been a lot more fun. Instead, I overemphasized poorly designed gimmicks. Of course, the best solution is to program and design the gimmicks better and use them in more creative ways, and that's what I hope to do in Iteration 5. There are all sorts of places I worked too quickly, and it shows. Now, I'm not a professional. My goal was not to sell Iteration 4, and my goal now is not to sell Iteration 5. I'm an amateur trying to enjoy game design from a new perspective, but I'm slowly becoming pickier about certain aspects of the game. I'm sure there are all sorts of corners I will cut and am cutting in Iteration 5, but the corners I cut in Iteration 4 are just too much for me now, and I think at least some of them will seem quite bad to you as well, so here's a few. The platforms in Iteration 4 were a lot simpler than the ones I'm making now in Iteration 5, and I think that difference shows. If you went back to a previous room, the enemies would reset. This was a problem for the scoring system, so ultimately I just didn't let you go back through doors, which in turn meant I couldn't have any subrooms. It's good that there were 80 characters, but I barely animated them. They're standing, walking, attacking, and attacking while walking. Some characters had less than that, and standing isn't even an animation, it's just a still image. Probably my worst offense, and I'm suitably embarrassed, I wasn't using hitboxes at the time, or rather the hitbox was just the character itself. So when you switched characters to someone bigger, you could clip into walls. Some of the programming around platforms feels a little awkward. And between all these mistakes in the foundation of the game, it was time to start over from scratch. But I think that will have to wait till the next video. Thanks so much for joining me for this first devlog. I think next week will be a more traditional game design video, and if all goes according to plan, this will be published alongside a more traditional game design short. I hope to do more devlogs in the future, but if you have an opinion on what kind of content you like from this channel, feel free to leave that in the comments. If you are interested in trying Iteration 4, which this video was about, or in what I've made so far of Iteration 5, you can find links to the itch.io pages in the description. Thanks again for watching.